and the Yuan Shi, History of the Yuan Dynasty, from 1370, assert Genghis founded Karakorum in 1220. This is unlikely, as we know Genghis spent all of 1220 campaigning in the Khwarezmian Empire. He did, however, pass through the Orkhan Valley, where Karakorum would later be built, on his way to invade Khwarezm in 1219. Entering the valley, Genghis would have noted much to find attractive. Rich in water and grass, vital to maintaining the Mongols' valuable herd animals, its central location in Mongolia also placed it in easier reach of merchants and envoys, while still a safe distance from any sedentary foe. Further, it was a region of cultural and imperial significance to nomads, as the Orkhan Valley was associated with the capitals of earlier steppe empires and confederations, such as the Uyghur Empire, whose capital of Karabalagun had been built there. Karabalagasun's ruins, or Ordu Balik, are only 30 kilometers north of where Karakorum was built. It's also the home of the famed Orkhan inscriptions of the Turkic Khaganates. For an ever-growing Mongol imperial identity as the masters of the steppes, it was a powerful political connection to lean on. While Genghis Khan may have designated the site of Karakorum to serve as the great capital of his empire, as we've shown in our previous episodes, he spent the remainder of his life on campaign and preparing for campaign. It's doubtful any construction was undertaken on his orders. While Ogadai may have built on a site chosen by his father, what he built was entirely his own and served as the administrative center of much of Eurasia for the next 30 years. Karakorum was not a huge city, even by medieval standards. Travelers to the city in the 1250s found a population of around 10,000 people. Separated into 4 quarters and surrounded by a low wall, Karakorum was an amazingly diverse city. Mosques, Christian churches, Confucian Taoist and Buddhist temples stood across the street from each other. Markets were constructed for merchants traveling from across the Muslim world, while Chinese craftsmen built the imperial palace and later captured artisans from Europe were brought back to further decorate it, most famously in the form of a silver tree with 4 spouts to pour various alcoholic drinks from. With its own mint for coinage, gold and silversmiths along with blacksmiths and other craftsmen, it served as a major production center. The major streets were paved with limestone, lined with wood to prevent displacement during the freezing and thawing cycles, and all atop gravel to aid in water drainage. A canal was even dug to bring water into the city and drive the water wheels of the smiths. Many scribes and members of the bureaucracy could be found there, taking in messages sent from across the empire via the Yam system and passing on instructions back. Numerous storehouses were built to house captured goods and tribute sent by subservient peoples, and it was to Ogadai's delight to showcase his generosity by using this loot to overpay merchants several times what their goods were worth. This served as an effective means to encourage merchants to actually make the journey to Karakorum, which, in contrast to a nomadic camp, featured amenities to keep visitors occupied and entertained. Limited agriculture was undertaken around the city, with evidence for wheat and barley, and one account mentions a proud farmer presenting his locally grown radishes to Ogadai. The city was not self-sufficient, however, and at its height required hundreds of cartloads of food to be shipped to the city daily in order to feed it, something which came to be a major strategic weakness later in the century. The Great Khan essentially used Karakorum as his office, and the city likely had few actual Mongols within it at any given time. Rather than actually residing in Karakorum's palace, Ogadai and his successors continued to nomadize around the capital, venturing within it sparingly as business or ritual commanded. Ogadai himself preferred another palace he had built in Mongolia, the Wenengong, or Palace of Eternal Peace. Having a fixed location to send diplomats and treasure was to the benefit of the empire, while also helping to rebuild the overland trade routes damaged in the initial Mongol expansion. Neither was it the only city in Mongolia at the time, though it was certainly the largest. There was also Qingkai Balasagun, meaning Qingkai's city, named for the able minister Qingkai, a former Ongut merchant who served as Ogedai's chancellor. Built by thousands of captured Chinese, it was intended as a logistics base in western Mongolia to prepare for the great invasion of Khwarezm, but had turned into a major farming and production center, manufacturing goods and weapons for Mongol armies. Ogedai's early reign was marked by activity. New conquests were launched across Eurasia, an extensive new administration was created, and a capital city built. Perhaps initially uncertain of how fit he was for the position, Ogedai was eager to prove himself a worthy successor to his awe-inspiring and terrifying father. The expansion of the Mongol Empire only continued under Ogedai, and his armies seemed unstoppable. Genghis Khan bequeathed him a mighty army, but Ogedai built a political system to back it up. A number of historians, for this reason, consider him to be the true founder of the Mongol Empire. But the zeal was soon burned out of Ogedai, and by 1237 he essentially removed himself from most affairs of state. With access to most of the alcohol of Eurasia, Ogedai busied himself by sampling as much as he could. His final years were swallowed up by constant drunkenness, and without his forceful presence, corruption set in. His second wife, Torgene Khatun, began exercising her own authority, pushing to the edge reform-minded figures such as Yalo Chusai and Mahmud Yalavach. This later period of Ogedai's rule and his weakness will be investigated in an upcoming episode, but our next episodes will detail the continued conquests by the Mongol armies on Ogedai's orders, beginning with the final destruction of the Jurchen Jin Empire. This will carry us on to the invasion of Europe, so be sure to subscribe to the Ages of Conquest, a Kings and Generals podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And if you want to help us continue to grow our audience, be sure to leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. A desperate, starving crowd of thousands presses together, smothering each other in the narrow city streets. Defenders clad in broken or hastily repaired lamellar armor hurry to and fro, responding to new alerts along the city walls. The constant thundering of stones slamming into the city walls. The loud cracks of bombs exploding, lobbed into houses by the enemy's siege weapons, and setting them alight. Screams, some ongoing and others cutting off suddenly, marking where a poor defender, foolish enough to stick his head over the ramparts, was struck by arrows. Outside the city, smoke billowed up, siege engines set on fire by the defender. Beyond them was the whinnying of tens of thousands of Mongol horses, with Chinese subjects and allies sharpening swords and preparing for the assault. Such was life in the nearly year-long siege of Kaifeng, capital of the Jin Empire, and now the target of the Mongol war machine. Today, we look at the final collapse of the Jurchen-ruled Jin dynasty, ending the 20-year-long Mongol conquest of northern China. Victory here laid the groundwork for Mongol war with the masters of southern China, the Song dynasty, setting the stage for a conflict which would eventually leave the Mongols the rulers of the Middle Kingdom. I'm your host David, and this is the Ages of Conquest, the Mongol invasions. We've covered the early stages of the Mongol-Jin War in previous episodes, but to give a quick recap, Mongol armies under Genghis Khan had invaded the Jin Empire in 1211. The Jin, ruled by the Jurchen hailing from Manchuria and ancestors of the later Manchu, controlled China north of the Huai River and had enjoyed a fearsome military reputation, renowned for their heavy cavalry and horse archers. But after nearly a century of their rule, the semi-nomadic Jurchen in China had adopted Chinese culture and language, losing their formidable military edge. Jin armies were routinely swept away in the field by the Mongols, and those Jurchen and Khitans, who still lived as nomads or semi-nomads, were soon allied with Genghis Khan. In 1215, the Emperor Xuanzong of Jin fled south of the Yellow River, abandoning the capital of Zhongdu, now modern Beijing, and cutting ties to his Manchurian homeland. Formerly hardy horsemen, the final emperors of the Jin dynasty, though still ethnically Jurchen, were now a little different from the Chinese. Their armies were now made up of Chinese infantry, having lost most of their access to the horse-producing regions. Defections from the Jin army early on in the war brought the Mongols knowledge of Chinese siege weapons, and soon the fortifications of northern China were reduced one by one. When Genghis Khan moved against the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, the Jin were granted no respite, as the talented commander Mughali was left to continue pressure on the Jin. Only Mughali's death in 1223 granted the Jin a brief rest, with Mongol attacks for the next few years becoming decidedly more limited. The Jin had been in an unenviable position from 1215 to 1223. Mongol pressure in the north was unrelenting and of great concern, bringing the losses of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. In the west, the Tangut-ruled Xixia, former Jin vassals, had submitted to the Mongols and joined them in attacking the Jin. In the east, the Shandong Peninsula and surrounding coastline was lost to a local insurrection known as the Redcoats, an umbrella term for a collection of independent warlords, some of whom declared for the Mongols, some of whom declared for the Song dynasty, and all hating the Jin. The Chinese Song dynasty ruled almost all of China south of the Huai River, and were a formidable economic power, as well as being longtime foes of the Jin. Having lost their northern territories and two emperors to the Jurchen in the early 1100s, few tears were shed in the Song court for the Jin struggles. In 1217, the Jin invaded the Song, a shocking development considering their ongoing military issues, but one with the intention to essentially provide further room to retreat from the Mongols. Fighting continued until 1221, proving both indecisive and wasteful. 1223 to 1224 provided an unexpected change of events. Beginning with Mughali's death, we have already noted reduction in Mongol pressure. Though Mughali's son and brother continued to campaign, it was without Tangut military support, as their forces had abandoned Mughali in his final days. Furthermore, Genghis Khan was still absent in Central Asia, though making his return. This was the first real breathing room northern China had experienced in well over a decade. In the first days of 1224, the Emperor Xuanzong of Jin died, succeeded by his third son, Ningjiasu, known also by his chosen Chinese personal name, Wanyan Xiushi, Wanyan being the royal clan of the Jurchen Jin. 25 years old on his ascension, Ningjiasu was the closest the Jin came to a competent monarch since the death of Shizong of Jin in 1189. More even-handed and thoughtful than Xuanzong of Jin, and more competent than the arrogant and inept Wei Xiaowang, had Ningjiasu taken the throne at any other time, he may have enjoyed a fine reputation. However, he was unable to arrest the collapse of his state and would die only a few hours before the end of his dynasty. In life, rulers of Chinese-style dynasties are simply known as the emperor, and prior to the Ming dynasty, would take era titles to delineate certain years of their reign. After their deaths, they are all given posthumous temple names, such as Taizu for dynastic founders. Xuanzong of Jin was the posthumous title for Ningjiasa's father, whose personal name had been Wudubu. Wudubu's predecessor was so hated, he was posthumously demoted from emperor to prince, and hence known as the Prince of Wei, or Wei Xiaowang. The posthumous temple name given to Ningjiasu was Aizong, meaning pitiable ancestor. His Chinese personal name, Shu Shu, was also turned into a pun by the Mongols, as it sounded similar to little slave. Aizong of Jin, as we'll call him, had a promising start to his reign. Both the Tangut and Song emperors died in a similar time, and Aizong quickly set about organizing peace between them, though no military cooperation came of this. Able to redistribute troops among the Mongols and Redcoats, the Jin also began to receive horses in trade from the Tangut. Seeking to improve relations with the Mongols on Genghis Khan's death, Aizong even sent envoys bearing formal condolences to the Mongols, though they were turned away. Jin forces were able to reoccupy some territory and strengthen fortifications. As we mentioned earlier, Xuanzong of Jin had moved the capital from Zhongdu to Kaifeng in 1215. Though a foolhardy decision which brought Mongol armies back into China, it wasn't strategically awful. Kaifeng, in the central Henan province, had been the capital of the Song dynasty before being captured by the Jurchen in the early 12th century. With massive walls, a large population, and rich hinterland, the city itself was difficult to siege. Unlike Zhongdu, which was situated comparatively close to Mongolia, Kaifeng was sheltered behind the Yellow River, fordable only at select and guarded points. Any passage directly over the river could prove highly costly. The Mongols would thus be more inclined to ford the river further along its great bend towards the Ordos, allowing them to make an approach to the west of the city. This would bring them into the mountainous territory in Shanxi province to Hainan's west, the passage between these provinces guarded by the fortress of Tongguan. Bordered by mountains and possessing a strong garrison, either Tongguan would have to be forced by a costly siege or bypassed entirely by cutting south through the territory of the now neutral Song dynasty. Indeed, this was advice Genghis Khan was said to have given his sons on his deathbed. But since peace had now been reached between Jin and Song, it was impossible to say if they would allow Mongol troops through their country unimpeded. Such was the problem Ogedai faced when he became Khan in 1229. Ogedai was not the military equal of his father or brothers, and to quiet questions of how fit he was to succeed his famous father, he needed to complete the conquest of the Jin. Growing bolder through the recapture of their cities, defeats of small Mongol parties, and absence of any major offensives for some years, the Jin would be a test of worthiness for the new Khan. Weeks after becoming Khan, Ogedai sent an army against the Jin, perhaps just to test the waters. A Mongol army of 8,000 under Dohulhu entered Shanxi at the end of 1229, besieging Qingyangfu. After a failed Jin peace embassy, a relief force was raised under the commander Pua, with a vanguard of the Loyal and Filial Army. Pua was a bit of a rapscallion who had led raids into Mongol-occupied territory for several years, looting and carrying off captured horses and provisions, then withdrawing before Mongol forces could catch him. Though his habit of playing up minor skirmishes like they were great victories, he had earned a reputation for skill against the Mongols, though whether it was deserved was another matter. The Loyal and Filial Army, which Pua had been associated with for years, also had an unsavory though effective reputation. Made up of deserters and captives from the Mongols, it included Northern Chinese, Uyghurs, Naiman, Tanguts, and the odd Kipchak. These were mounted units specializing in Mongol tactics. Paid 3 times that of a normal soldier to encourage defections from the diverse Mongol armies, by the 1230s, this was a crack force of 7,000. Often undisciplined and unruly, they proved effective at plundering and were fine horse archers. One of Pua's commanders, Cheng He Sheng, commanded a 1,000-strong vanguard of these men. At Dachangyuan in January and February of 1230, Pua drew Dolhuhu's force up for battle. Cheng He Sheng led the Loyal and Filial Army as vanguard, and for the first time in nearly 20 years of war, the Jin defeated the Mongols in open battle. After the battle, Pua released a captured Mongol envoy and sent him to Ogedai with a simple message. "We've got all our soldiers and horses ready. Come on over and fight." Soon afterwards, Pua, Chiang He-sheng, and the general Hada defeated a Mongol army investing Weizhou on the northern bank of the Yellow River in Henan. Ogadai was furious and frightened. Dolhuhu was removed from command and possibly poisoned. Pua's boast, followed by actual Jin victories, coupled with peace between Jin and Song, made the new Khan very nervous. Naysayers within his own court, who whispered how the more militaristic Tolui, Ogadai's younger brother, should have been Khan, saw this as a sign of heaven's displeasure. Ogadai tried to quiet these whispers by saying this was like the candle flaring up before it goes out, while at the same time raising a large army to personally lead against the Jin. It should be noted that details of this campaign are often contradictory, with later authors hiding details due to the Mongols' defeats suffered in the campaign. The reconstruction which will follow is based on the work of historian Dr. Christopher Atwood and his fantastic article on Dolhuhi's death. Ogadai set out in early 1231, praying for 9 days to eternal blue heaven for victory. His solution to the described defenses of the Jin, the wide and fast-moving Yellow River guarding the north, the neutral Song border to the south, and the fortress of Tongguan protecting the west, was to bring the full might of his army against Tongguan to force it or bypass it. Up to 100,000 men in Ogadai's army, including his brother Tolui, the general Subadai, freshly recalled from the western steppe, and Mongols, Khitans, Uyghurs, and subject Chinese, marched into Shanxi province, already suffering from a severe famine. With such a large army and limited resources available, Ogadai needed to find a way through Tongguan quickly. The Jin commanders, Pua and Hada, pulled all their available troops out of Shanxi before the Mongol advance in order to reinforce Tongguan, and it quickly became apparent that an assault on the fort would be both costly and lengthy. An attempt by Ogadai's adopted brother, Shigi Hutuhu, to draw the Jin defenders into a feigned retreat resulted in heavy Mongol losses, the Jin refusing to leave the safety of their fortifications. Subadai, for his part, was able to find a route through the hills south of Tongguan and seemed likely to outflank the fort. However, his forces became spread too thin during the rough voyage, and a counterattack led by Chiang He-sheng and 1,000 of the loyal and filial troops defeated Subadai at Daohuigu. Subadai and part of his force returned, humbled, to Ogadai, who was so furious he threatened to totally remove him from command, and was only restrained by Tolui. The Mongols withdrew from Tongguan, besieging the large city of Fenxiangfu. The city fell in May 1231, 400 catapults concentrating on one corner of the walls. Despite this victory, Ogadai's mood was little improved, and lambasted his generals, saying, "If Mukhali was alive, I would not have had to come here myself." Struggling to support the large army in famine-stricken Shanxi, Ogadai ordered a withdrawal to Inner Mongolia for the summer of 1231 and to replan the assault. There, Tolui suggested a plan which their father had discussed in his final days, bypassing Tongguan by going south through Song territory and arriving deep behind Jin defenses. Ogadai agreed, ordering Tolui and Subadai to take their tumans on this flanking maneuver. Meanwhile, Ogadai and the main army would attempt a crossing of the Yellow River, while a smaller force under Ochin Noyan was to try the end of the Yellow River in Shandong, guarding Ogadai from encirclement. The plan was for their armies to act as a giant pincer, striking Kaifeng from the north and southwest simultaneously, Tolui coming up behind enemy lines and preventing the Jin from marshalling all of their forces on a single army. Nothing started off to plan. While Ogadai's force was held up by a long siege at Heizhoufu in their efforts to cross the Yellow River, early indications were that the Song would not cooperate with Tolui. At the start of 1231, the Song had killed Li Chuan, the Mongols' redcoat ally in Shandong. Also, the envoy sent at the end of summer to request passage through Song territory had disappeared. Entering into the Song Empire without their approval could mean Tului would face resistance or an army. If Tului was bogged down fighting Song troops, he would be unable to rendezvous with Ogadai, leaving his brother isolated. Much of Tului's army had been in famine-stricken Shanxi or relocated to the barren Qinling Mountains during the summer of 1231. Lacking resources to feed perhaps 20 to 30,000 men, medieval authors speak of cannibalism occurring here. They could hardly eat the horses they needed for war, after all. These starving men faced a difficult ride through hostile territory, beyond which they needed to return to the Jin realm with strength and numbers to fight. It's a testament to Tului's military ability that he kept his men together through this hard ride through mountainous territory. Once they reached the Song border in November 1231, Tului allowed his men a month of pillaging across Sichuan. This Song province was rich, fertile, and untouched by the 2 decades of Mongol-Jin warfare, a chance for Tului's men to regain strength, morale, and fatten their horses. It also showcased a noted weakness of the Song border defenses. Tului's troops traveled over 290 kilometers into Song territory before turning back. This was not the first occasion of Song-Mongol warfare. A brief clash had occurred in 1227 during the destruction of the Tangut Kingdom, when Mongol forces attacking the western edge of the Jin Empire had gone over the border and raided Song prefectures. The chief counselor of the Song dynasty, Shi Mi Yuan, in power since 1208, was as cautious and pragmatic as he was unpopular in the empire, and he was very unpopular. Neither clash was enough for him to send Song Chinese to die at Mongol hands, and he didn't let Tului's raid escalate into a full military response. Tului was thus able to enter the southern flank of Jin-ruled Henan province in January 1232. The Jin were panicking now, and Pua and Hada rapidly withdrew the garrisons of Tongguan to catch Tului. At Sanfeng Mountain, Tului and Subutai found themselves surrounded by multiple converging Jin forces under Pua and Hada. Pua sent a message to Tului which, in the words of the Ilkhanid Vizier Rashid al-Din, the Jin threatened to do this and that to their womenfolk. The actual message was certainly not so polite, and Tului bristled at this. Surrounded, the Mongols were in a tough position. Aid came from an unexpected direction, as it suddenly began to snow forcefully, a blizzard mixed with hail. Subadai reminded Tului that they were facing soft men from cities and small villages. The Mongols, used to harsh winters on the open steppe, put on their winter coats and waited on their horses. The Jin troops were unprepared for the early February storm, and for 4 days they froze and suffered. On the 4th day, deciding their enemy was suitably weakened, Tului ordered the assault. Racing down the mountainside, the Mongols cut into the Jin and obliterated them, Pua and Hada both captured. As punishment for their threat to rape the Mongol women, we are told the Mongols sodomized the captured Jin troops and made a huge mound of severed ears from the slain. The defeat at Sanfeng Mountain and capture of their best generals marked the end of the Jin dynasty's offensive capabilities. Ogadai pushed through the northern defenses and was soon reunited with his brother. Subadai was given overall command of the army while Ogadai and Tului returned to Mongolia, possibly because Ogadai had fallen quite ill. In April 1232, Subadai began the siege of Kaifeng, a noose which took almost a year to tighten. Ogadai and Tului returned to Mongolia. Precisely what occurred is unclear, but by the end of 1232, Tului was dead. The official version in the secret history of the Mongols had Ogadai fall deathly ill, and Tului urges the spirits to take him instead, sacrificing himself for his brother. But mention of him drinking a special brew prepared for him have fueled rumors that Ogadai in fact had his brother poisoned. The problem with this theory is that it relies too strongly on later antagonism between the heirs of Ogadai and Tului. By all accounts, the two brothers were extremely close, and later editing to what became the secret history of the Mongols by Tului's sons, may have chosen to portray their father more heroically, and by villainizing Ogadai, helped justify their eventual ascension to the throne. Other writers like Giovanni say Tului drank himself to death. Since this was the fate Ogadai and numerous other Mongolian princes shared, this is actually rather likely. Ogadai Khan lost his closest companion late in 1232, a loss from which he never recovered. Back at Kaifeng, Subadai led a brutal siege. The city, so flooded with refugees that it held over 1 million people, was totally blockaded, starvation and pandemic setting in over the summer of 1232. Gunpowder weapons were used by both sides in the form of bombs lobbed by catapults and in fire lances by the Jin. Essentially a flamethrower, fire lances shot a jet of fire 3 meters long, burning men to death horrifically, and were used to effectively block breaches in walls. You can see them in action in episode 10, season 1 of Netflix's Marco Polo. Subadai tried various means to breach the walls of Kaifeng, but the city was skillfully defended. Sappers would approach the wall under mobile shelters with the intention to physically dig through them. Jin defenders dropped bombs onto them, destroying both shelters and attackers. Dikes on the Yellow River were broken, flooding the plain and the city. This resistance was valiant but ultimately doomed. The Jin leadership was chaotic, with individuals promoted, then demoted and executed within days for perceived slights or on suspicion of treachery. Finally, in February 1233, Aizong of Jin abandoned the city, with some loyal guards leaving it to its fate. One commander left in Kaifeng, Sui Li, assassinated those still loyal to Aizong, leaving himself in control. Realizing the only way to spare the population was a voluntary surrender, on 29th of May 1233, Sui Li opened the gates to Subadai. Ogadai was urged to mercy by the protests of his advisor, Yellow Chutsai, and Subadai was restricted to plundering, killing only 500 members of the royal Wanyan clan, who were still in the city. Sui Li, for his efforts, was assassinated by another Jin officer in response for an offense Sui Li had committed to the man's wife. By August 1233, Aizong of Jin and his ever-decreasing retinue fled to Caizhou, only 64 kilometers from the Song border. Aizong's messages to the Song for aid, warning them that they would be the next targets of the Mongols, fell on deaf ears. The Song agreed to cooperate with the Mongols against the Jin, closing off Aizong's route of escape. By November 1233, a Song army joined Subadai outside Caizhou. Caizhou was reduced to starvation, but its defenders fought tooth and nail, inflicting heavy casualties. But there could be no other end. As Mongol Song forces filled in a lake nearby with bundles of reeds and sticks to gain access to the city in February 1234, Aizong declared he would not be remembered as the last Jin emperor. He abdicated for a distant relation, a man in better shape who Aizong faintly hoped would escape and continue to resist. Barely had Aizong hanged himself and the new emperor been enthroned when the Mongols had broken through the walls. On the 9th of February 1234, the final emperor of the Jin dynasty died fighting in the streets alongside his men, having reigned only a few hours. So ended the Jurchen Jin dynasty, controlling North China for a little over a century. Despite defections, defeats, and numerous other setbacks, both Jurchen and Chinese alike showed loyalty to the dynasty to the very end. Few other kingdoms had suffered the full might of the Mongols as the Jin had, and it was not an easy conquest. In 400 years, the descendants of the Jurchen, the Manchu, would come to rule both the Mongols and the Chinese, but that's quite another story. The Mongol-Song alliance barely outlasted the Jin. Subadai moved north with his armies not long afterwards, eager for discussions on where to take them next. The Song commander in the region, Mengung, withdrew as well, the devastated Henan province no place to keep an army fed. Aside from a few sites, most of the area, including Kaifeng, stayed in Mongol hands. As we've noted earlier, Kaifeng had once been a capital of the Song dynasty before it fell to the Jurchen. Long had voices in the Song clamored to reclaim the north. Chief Counselor Shi Mi-yuan had kept these hawks in check during his long administration, but his death in late 1233 left a vacuum, one the feeble Emperor Lizong of Song could not fill. These Song officials and commanders who had first-hand experience of conditions in the north and against the Mongols knew what a foolhardy thought a campaign there would be, and understood the limits of the Song army, an army which had never performed well offensively against either the Khitan Liao or Jurchen Jin. However, Song generals who had won battles against the Redcoats and had been uninvolved with the Xiaozhou campaign were ecstatic at news of the destruction of the Jin and immediately urged war. Assuming the local Chinese would happily rise up and supply them, two Song armies marched into Henan in summer 1234, walking into the undefended Kaifeng and Luoyang, the birthplace of the founder of the Song dynasty, and found a population hardly able to feed itself, let alone an entire army. So expectant of a gracious local population, the Song armies had brought provisions for only 2 weeks. Their men refused to advance further, and a retreat began, just as Mongol forces returned to deal with the incursion. The Song army at Luoyang was ambushed and almost totally destroyed. For a campaign that had lasted barely a month, the Song had unwittingly began what was to be a 40-year-long war, resulting in the destruction of their own dynasty. Rather inconclusive Mongol-Song warfare continued for the rest of Ogedai's reign. Much of the Mongol armies freed up from the fall of the Jin were sent to conquer the far west. This early Mongol-Song conflict did cost the life of one of Ogedai's sons and designated heir, Kochu, in 1236. This was perhaps the final blow to Ogedai's interest in anything other than alcoholism, which consumed his final years, even as his armies under Subadai blazed into Europe. But we'll return to those years of Ogedai's reign in future episodes. Our next episode will discuss the continued Mongol expansion into the Middle East in the 1230s, led by Chormahun Noyan against the Khwarezmian prince Jalal al-Din Mingbornu. So be sure to subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Positive reviews on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or any other podcast catcher of your choice are also greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. Kubacha and various Hindu lords uniting against him, as well as Dorbe Dokshin, now on his second approach. Learning that a half-brother had set up a state in western Iran, Jalal al-Din decided it was a good time to depart India in 1224, leaving his officers Ozbek Bey and Hassan Kharlug in control of his Indian territory. They, along with Kubacha, took the full brunt of Dorbe Dokshin's returning army, who took his frustration out on them when he found himself unable to locate Jalal al-Din. While this proved unfortunate for them, Iltutmish did rather well out of this episode, with his major rivals weakened by both Jalal al-Din and the Mongol attacks, and with his own state relatively untouched. Over the late 1220s and 30s, Iltutmish was able to overcome these rivals and set the Delhi Sultanate on a path to regional dominance. In due course, we will return to Iltutmish's successors, but for now, we will follow our friend Jalal al-Din westwards. Jalal al-Din's 3 years in India did little for his dream of restoring the Khwarezmian Empire, but saw better opportunity in the efforts of his half-brother, Ghiyath al-Din. Around Ray, modern Tehran, Ghiyath al-Din had started to re-establish Khwarezmian control. Jalal al-Din's thought, however, seems to have been that if anyone was to continue the Khwarezmian Empire, it was going to be him, damn it. Mingburnu cut across southern Iran, hoping to restore Khwarezmian rule as he went, first stopping in the province of Kerman. There, Barak Hajib ruled, a former general of the Kharkitai brought into Khwarezmian service, who established his own independence in the wake of the Mongol invasion. Jalal al-Din gained his submission and married one of his daughters, though Barak soon revolted and Mingburnu carried on. At Shiraz, in the province of Fars, he was welcomed and again married a daughter of the local dynasty, the Salgurids. He then departed for Isfahan, where he rested his main army. With a handful of picked horsemen, said to be carrying banners of white cloth like the Mongols, Jalal al-Din led a daring raid against his half-brother, attacking him in his camp, capturing him, and absorbing his followers and territories. This greatly strengthened his position. Knowing that the former northeastern sections of the Khwarezmian Empire, including the former capitals of Gurganj and Samarkand, were under firm Mongol control, Mingburnu must have thought it more prudent to push west, in theory providing himself more resources and space to resist the Mongols. Gaining the submission of the chiefs of Luristan, marrying princesses of local Turkomans, he now had a not insubstantial force under his belt. Most of southern, central, and western Iran had now submitted or was under his direct control. Casting his eyes west, he marched towards Baghdad. Supposedly, he was expecting assistance from the Caliph, at that time an-Nasir, who had reigned since 1180. Caliph an-Nasir had been paralyzed and blind for a few years at that point, but the memory of Muhammad Khwarezm Shah's own failed march on Baghdad had not been forgotten. Anticipating that the son shared the same greed as the father, an army was dispatched to repel Jalal al-Din. Drawing them into a feigned retreat, Jalal al-Din put them to flight, pursuing them as far as Baghdad's suburbs before withdrawing, and then defeating a force sent from Irbil, capturing that city's ruler. Lacking the means to siege Baghdad itself, Jalal al-Din sought easier targets. He moved next against the Eldeguzid Atabegs of Azerbaijan, former Khwarezmian vassals, who had submitted to the Mongols, and destroyed them in 1225, taking their capital of Tabriz. A brief Georgian foray against Tabriz, while Jalal al-Din was mopping up remnants of the Eldeguzids, brought him, for the first time in his life, into conflict with Christians. Over the next few years, Jalal al-Din unleashed a torrent of destruction against the Kingdom of Georgia. At that time, ruling Georgia and Greater Armenia, the kingdom had suffered terribly during Zhev and Subadai's own expedition through the region only a few years prior. In 1226, Jalal al-Din took the Georgian capital Tbilisi, destroying the churches within the city. According to a contemporary historian, Kyriakos Ganjagetsi, rather than spend time to determine who in the city's diverse population was Christian or Muslim, Jalal al-Din simply ordered all the men to be circumcised. After this, Mingburnu marched rapidly back to Iran, having heard rumors that Barak Hajib was attacking Isfahan, the new Khwarezmian capital. Barak apologized and sent gifts, and while Jalal al-Din rested in Isfahan, he learned that the Georgians were revolting. Speeding back to Georgia, Jalal al-Din undertook a slaughter outside the walls of Akhlat, but was unable to enter the city. In similar time, news reached him of another threat to Isfahan. A Mongol army was approaching the city, ordered there by Chin Temur, the Mongol-appointed governor of Gurganj, the former capital of Khwarezm. Jalal al-Din brought his army back to Isfahan, and in August 1228, bravely led his forces to be defeated by the Mongols. His half-brother Ghiyath al-Din fled, and Jalal al-Din was forced to retreat when the Mongols drove back his remaining forces. However, with losses high, or fearing a trap, the Mongols failed to advance and withdrew back to their own empire. Thus was Isfahan saved, if only narrowly. Now, really changing things up, Jalal al-Din returned to Georgia again in late 1228, and inflicted one of the most famous defeats in Georgian history at Bolnisi, also known as Mindori. A large army of Georgians, Armenians, and various other ethnic groups from across the Caucasian mountains, as well as a significant Kipchak component, had been assembled against him. Kipchaks had a long history of serving as mercenaries for both the Georgian kingdom and the Khwarezm Shahs, and we may well assume a number were present among Mingbornu's forces. Outnumbered and lacking swordsmen and lancers, it was a precarious position for Jalal al-Din. His vizier, Yulduzci, suggested it would be better to pass behind the enemy, cutting them off from water, thus weakening the larger force in the heat. Jalal al-Din's reaction, as recorded by Giovanni, is rather illustrative of his character. Becoming as enraged as was possible for him, he hurled a pen case at the vizier's head while shouting, "They are a flock of sheep! Does the lion complain of the size of the flock?" It's unfortunate for Mingbornu that this was a mantra he applied to everything. Yulduzci repented, paying a fine of 50,000 dinars. Opening contact with the Kipchak, reminding them of his own connections with their people, he successfully convinced them to remove themselves from the battlefield. Then, he convinced the Georgians to send champions out to face him. Supposedly, Jalal al-Din killed them all himself, then ordered a general charge against the demoralized Georgians. The foe was destroyed, and we might well regard this as the high watermark of his military career. The last half of 1229, Jalal al-Din was held up besieging Akhlat, falling only to great massacre in April 1230 after an 8-month siege. Learning that the Seljuk Sultan, Kaikubad I, master of Anatolia, was organizing an alliance against him, Jalal al-Din moved west. Falling ill, he lost his strength and was unable to ride his horse, forced to be carried in a litter. At Yazid Chemen near Edzinjan in August 1230, Jalal al-Din met an allied force of Seljuks under Kaikubad I and Ayyubid Sultan of Syria al-Ashraf, the nephew of the famed Saladin. During the battle, Jalal al-Din tried to mount his horse, but lacked the strength to even hold the reins. His courtiers pulled him back. Seeing his banners fall back, the army thought Jalal al-Din was retreating, and thinking the battle thus lost, fled. The Seljuk Abbasid forces, believing it a feigned retreat, held their ground. Jalal al-Din escaped another major military defeat, this time while seriously ill. Certain to improve his mood, however, was news of a large Mongol army now approaching. Far to the east, Ogedai had been elected Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Aware of Jalal al-Din's resurgence, Ogedai could not allow him to reform the Khwarezmian Empire. So, seeking to complete the conquest of the region, and perhaps even hoping to take Baghdad itself, Ogedai ordered fresh troops to be sent. Commanded by Chormahun, a member of the Keshig, the imperial bodyguard, and a veteran of the Khwarezmian campaign, this is our first mention in the sources of the Tama. The Tama was essentially the closest the Mongols came to garrison duty sent to the empire's borders to expand, consolidate, and intimidate, rather than a full tsunami-like tidal wave of invasion. There is some suggestion Chormahun may have initially been ordered west by Chinggis Khan in his final days, but would have been held up by the Khan's death in 1227. Ogedai in that case would have been reaffirming his father's decision. So Chormahun set out with perhaps 30,000 men, ordered to be supported and reinforced by the appointed Baskaks and Darukhachi governing the Western Mongol Empire, like Chin Timur. In early 1230, Chormahun crossed the Amu Darya and began the proper subjugation of Khorasan, which had been left a ruinous buffer after the 1220 invasion. Chormahun bypassed those few strongpoints still holding out, leaving Chin Timur to reduce them and set up a proper administration in his wake. By autumn 1230, Chormahun was in Mazandaran, northern Iran, and took Rai, which he set up as his headquarters. Chormahun spent the next 2 years in Rai, from where he ordered his various forces and took the submission of most of the powers in Iran, the states of the south sending representatives and recognizing Mongol rule. By 1233, essentially all that was left of Jalal al-Din's reconstituted Khwarezmian Empire in Iran had submitted to the Mongols, leaving his capital of Isfahan isolated until it fell in 1236. In eastern Khorasan, that is now modern eastern Iran and Afghanistan, Chormakhun's lieutenants Dair and Mongedu operated, driving out Khwarezmian holdouts. By 1235, they had brought the Mongol Empire to the borders of India, forcing an officer Jalal al-Din had left behind, Hassan Khwarlug, to submit. It seems even that the Ismailis, the famed order of assassins, allied themselves with the Mongols, providing intelligence on Jalal al-Din's movements and strength. By spring 1231, Mongol forces had entered Azerbaijan's Mugan plain, zeroing in on Mingburnu. He frantically sent word to the Seljuk Sultan and Ayyubid, Sultan of Syria, urging cooperation against the Mongols. But it was too little too late. Jalal ad-Din had long ago soured the relationship through his aggression. Too busy riding and campaigning, he had not created anything in the last decade to actually prepare for the return of the Mongols, and now he paid for it. He spent 1231 hopping across the Caucasus, narrowly avoiding Mongol forces. At one point, he only just escaped his camp as the Mongols came across it, only the action of a general waving Mingburnu's banners, and therefore distracting them, giving Jalal al-Din enough time to escape. Near Diyarbakir, also known as Amida, in what is now southeastern Turkey, his luck finally ran out. Hounded down to just a few followers, in mid-1231, he was killed by Kurdish bandits, robbing him for his robes. The clothes were recognized, the Kurds killed, and the body thought to be that of Jalal al-Din buried. And so ended the reign of Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, final ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire. A fine soldier and warrior, but a poor king, he could not improve upon the Khwarezmian tradition of treachery and aggression to his neighbors. With the time, energy, troops, experience, and personal charisma, Jalal al-Din had the potential to build a proper resistance to the Mongols, yet he instead squandered this opportunity, in many ways showing himself little better than them. Still, he remained a powerful symbol. For years, rumors persisted of his survival, and every once in a while, someone would claim his identity, only to be swiftly killed by the Mongols. Many a medieval Muslim author glorified him, such as his own secretary Nasawi, the Khwarezmian refugee to Delhi Juzjani, and even Juivani, a bureaucrat who worked for the Mongols. We might consider him the Bonnie Prince Charlie of the 13th century Muslim world, a figure whose actual person could not stand up to the legend and potential of his idea. Jalal al-Din's demise had other consequences. For one, there was still a large body of Khwarezmian troops in the region, fleeing the Mongols and now acting as mercenaries. In time, they were displaced from their refuge in Syria, making their way south, and in 1244 took Jerusalem. Jerusalem had only been in Christian control again since Emperor Frederick II's crusade in 1228. Not until 1917 would Jerusalem again be controlled by non-Muslims. In Azerbaijan, Tabriz came under Mongol rule quickly after Mingburnu's death. With Iran secured, Chormakhun marched into newly subjugated Azerbaijan and there planned the conquest of the Caucasus. Georgia was severely weakened. First, Zev and Subadai's attacks, then Jalal al-Din's repeated depredations. It would just be a matter of reducing fortresses. In 1236, Chormakhun ordered a three-pronged assault against the territories of the Georgian kingdom. Chormakhun himself drove into Greater Armenia, Mular up the Kura Valley, and Chagadai Noyan, known as the Lesser to distinguish himself from Genghis's son, attacked Georgia proper. So weakened, the Georgians could offer no unified defense, with each lord retreating to his own castle in the mountains. The Mongols moved at a leisurely, careful pace, forcing some castles, but needing to starve others out. Some Armenian and Georgian lords, like the influential Awag Zakarian, willingly submitted, receiving special treatment and encouraging others to follow his example. With the flight of the Georgian queen Rusudan from Tbilisi, Awag was the most powerful lord in the kingdom and assisted in the Mongol expansion. In 1238, Tbilisi fell to Jagatai Noyan, Queen Rusudan fleeing into the far western mountains of Georgian territory near the Black Sea. So remote was it that the Mongols did not even pursue her. By that point, Subadai and Batu's armies were overrunning the steppes north of the Caucasus, so perhaps they felt her trapped between them. The conquest of the Caucasus was essentially complete by 1240. Though it saw its share of massacres, it was considerably less disastrous for the locals than, say, the war against the Jurchen Jin had been in North China. You know, if you want to compare scales of devastation. Most local forms of government were allowed to continue operating, though now with Mongol overlordship at the top. The Mugan Plain in Azerbaijan became a favored center for Mongol power, and in time a political center under the Ilkhanate. For more details on Mongol rule in the region, one can easily find a copy of Bayer Saikan's Dashtundag's The Mongols and the Armenians online, kindly uploaded to the internet and academia.edu by Dashtundag herself. The early 1240s saw notable political upheaval in the Mongol Empire. Of course, at the end of 1241, we have Ogadai Khan's own death, though we'll deal with that in a later episode. Chormahun was struck down by paralytic disease, leaving him unable to command, his wife acting as a regent until officially replaced by his lieutenant, Baiju Noyan. Baiju had a habit, even from Mongol standards, of ordering senseless executions. It's Baiju who brings us to the final section of today's episode, the Battle of Kushe Dag. The Seljuks of Rum, as the Anatolian branch of the once mighty dynasty was known, had experienced a heyday and expansion under Kaikubad I. After his death in 1236, he was succeeded by Kaikhusra II, not his equal and certainly not up to repelling the predatory Baiju. From 1240 to 1241, a Turkoman revolt led by Baba Ishak hamstrung the Seljuk state, and Baiju took note of this Seljuk weakness. In 1242, hungry to continue expanding, Baiju led his armies into Anatolia. The Seljuk-controlled Armenian city of Erzurum was a first target. After a 2-month siege, catapults brought down the city walls. The Christians and Muslims within the city brought to an indiscriminate slaughter. Valuable gospels found in Erzurum were gifted by Baiju to his Christian followers, while Armenian princes in his army sought to rescue those taken as slaves. Following further campaigning, Baiju returned to the Mugan Plain for winter 1242 before returning to Anatolia in spring 1243. The Seljuk Sultan, Kaikhusra II, had boasted he would march and defeat the Mongols in the Mugan. Baiju marched back into Anatolia before Kaikhusra's men were even mobilized. Kaikhusra tried to get reinforcements from his vassals and allies at Trebizond, Aleppo, Nicaea, and Cilicia in Armenia. The Armenian king, Hetun I, was a keen observer and knew that the drunkard sultan, Kaikhusra, fared little chance and held his forces back. Erzincan, Sivas, Kayseri all fell to Baiju as he pushed into Anatolia. He brought with him a large, multi-ethnic force, with notable Armenian and Georgian contingents. Baiju encouraged the intermingling of his forces so as to prevent ethnic rivalries flaring up and increasing unit cohesion. By June 26, 1243, Baiju caught the Sultan's army in the defile of Kushe Dag, what is now northeastern Turkey. The Seljuks likewise had brought a diverse contingent, including important Frankish mercenaries, commanded by a Cypriot and a Venetian. Kaikusra drank himself into a stupor the night before and was so hungover that army organization was non-existent, his force failing to assemble until late in the day. Stationed well beyond the lines, the Sultan had little awareness of what was happening at the front. Morale was poor, the Mongols' reputation was one of invincibility and absolute terror. There could only be one end. Mongol horse archers, supported by Georgian and Armenian heavy cavalry, clashed with the Turkish and Frankish troops of the Seljuk Sultan. Within an hour, they had broken and fled. So sudden was the Seljuk flight that Baiju suspected it had to be a feigned retreat and held his army back. Only cautiously did he send scouts forward to check out the abandoned Sultan's camp, and when they found it truly abandoned, the celebration was great. Kaikusra left all his treasure behind in his flight, and what a great deal of treasure it was. Though he survived, his reputation and military were broken. The Seljuks had little option but to submit to the Mongols, as did the king of the Armenian Cilicia, Hetun I, leaving the Mongols as masters of Anatolia. The Koshe Dag campaign was a part of a growing shift in Mongol military thought. Under Genghis Khan, campaigns were normally a reaction to an incident or a need. The Otrar massacre was, of course, an important precipitate to the Khwarezmian campaign, but Genghis had tried to avoid it, even after the massacre, sending envoys to seek a peaceable solution. Only when his envoys were killed by Muhammad Khwarezm Shah did Genghis Khan order an assault. The initial campaigns ordered by Ogadai were sent against targets who had survived Genghis Khan's invasions, that is the Jurchen Jin and Jalal al-Din. But by Shormakund's final years, and the time Baiju took office in 1241, the justifications for invasions grew ever flimsier. The great weakened kingdom of Georgia and the Seljuks of Rum were not a threat to the already vast Mongol Empire, though the Georgians were considered enemies since Zhev and Subadai's expedition. No, this was conquest for the sake of conquest. Baiju attacked the Seljuks in their moment of weakness for little reason other than the expansion of the Mongol Empire. This was the manifestation of the belief that the Chinggisids were to rule everything under the eternal blue heaven. The very existence of non-subject powers was, in itself, resistance against the will of heaven. The Khan had no allies, only vassals. The submission of the Anatolian Seljuks by the mid-1240s marked the high point of Mongol efforts in the region for some years. Baiju probed Syria, bringing the submission of local Ayyubid princes there, and his armies tested the border of Iraq. However, the Mongols seem to have been under the impression that Baghdad was supported by a massive army, and were hesitant to commit to any serious operation against it. It would not be until the arrival of Hulegu in the 1250s that the Mongol conquest in the region would be finalized. As it was, Mongol rule now stretched from the Mediterranean and Black Seas all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and still continued to expand. Our next episode will begin to cover the conquest of the Great Western Steppe, the prelude to the invasion of Europe proper. So be sure to subscribe to Ages of Conquest podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Please also consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. Had you a bird's eye view of the Eurasian steppe in 1236, you could have watched an unparalleled sight. Perhaps more than 100,000 mounted warriors, spread out in vast columns, converging upon the Kama River, followed with nigh on 1 million horses, goats, and sheep some distance behind. thousands of carts, some small enough to be pulled by a single ox, to those so large they required full teams of oxen. Mounted on these carts were spare weapons and arrows, specialists and engineers in siege technology, and the tools they needed to build their fearsome machinery. And on the largest carts, Royal Mongols' gurs, round felt tents to house the many princes leading the army. Their very movement changed the landscape, politically and ecologically. The nomadic Turkic peoples who inhabited the steppe fled before them. New roads were cut, others formed by the very passage of 10,000 horses, stripping bare the landscape. To avoid lengthy detours in order to stay on schedule, rivers were blocked and diverted to accommodate the great carts. This was an army with one purpose: to conquer everything as far as the hooves of Mongol horses would take them. This was the Great Western Invasion. Mongol princes from across the dynasty collected and hurled like a great spear westwards, which, in the coming years, would land deep into Europe. I'm your host David, and this is the Mongol Conquests. The Great Western Invasion is perhaps the most famous campaign of the Mongol Empire. It's a campaign of big names and big personalities: Batu, Monkey, Guyuk, and the great commander Subadai. It's a story of which you likely already know the broad strokes: the bloody conquest of the Russian principalities, culminating in the famous battles of Liegnitz and Mohi. It's generally presented as the master stroke of Subadai's strategic genius. Commonly said that the Mongols would have driven right to the shores of Britain if it hadn't been for the untimely death of Ogadai Khan at the end of 1241, forcing their withdrawal in order to elect his successor. It's a great story and quite cinematic, but one which barely conveys any of the complexities of the Great Invasion, and one certainly ripe with exaggerations and myth. Over the next episodes, we're going to try to change your view of the invasion, including as many of the intricacies and historiography on it as we can to provide a fuller understanding of the campaign and a better and more nuanced respect for Mongol military success. So let's get started. Mongol knowledge of the West came through an offshoot of the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, when Zhevnoyan and Subutai Batar led an army through the Caucasus and onto the steppe, where they fought with the nomadic Turkic Kuman Kipchak tribes, an army of the Rus principalities on the Kalka River, and the Volga Bulgars, the mercantile masters of the Volga River's trade routes. We covered this in a previous episode, so check that out for the specifics. Though popularly portrayed as a reconnaissance in force, it was a hard-fought campaign, resulting in the death of Zhevnoyan and both Mongol defeats and only narrowly won victories. The defeats demanded Mongol retaliation, as did the loss of a top commander. It's easy to imagine Subadai personally wanting to avenge his fallen friend, as Zhev may have been a mentor to him. The foes encountered in the west had shown themselves fierce fighters, and the Mongols left with an impression that overwhelming force was needed for further campaigning in the region. The Kuman Kipchaks, a loose confederation of Turkic tribes inhabiting the steppes from the borders of Hungary to past the Caspian Sea, were a particular issue. Nomadic enemies, similar in lifestyle to the Mongols themselves, were perceived as their greatest threat. Not only could they more readily flee Mongol armies than any sedentary foe, thus continuing to be a threat, but they were likewise skilled horse archers. If united under a charismatic leader, as Genghis Khan had done with the Mongol tribes, the Kuman Kipchaks could directly challenge Mongolian hegemony in the steppe. In the Mongol universalist ideology, which developed at the end of Genghis Khan's life, everything beneath eternal blue heaven was the Mongols to rule. The fact that these foes had fought against the Mongols, at times even besting them, was considered a state of open rebellion that the Great Khan could not allow. Subadai had withdrawn from the steppe over 1224, but that was not the final Mongol encounter in the west before the Great Invasion. Modern Kazakhstan was by then the Ulus of Jochi, the territory granted to Genghis Khan's eldest son. As Jochi had died in 1225, the appanage was now headed by Jochi's second son, Batu. This was the territorial beginnings of the later Golden Horde. From the Jochid Ulus, the Mongols had a forward base to attack their foes within the Volga steppe. The closest foe was the Volga Bulgars, a distant Turkic relation to the Bulgarians who gave their name to the empires on the Danube in southeastern Europe and the Balkans. Controlling the meeting point of the Volga and Kama rivers, their influence extended to the Urals in the east and to the borders of the Rus principalities in the west. Dominating the fur trade and other exports from the local Finno-Ugric population, like the Mordvins and Bashkirs, Volga Bulgaria was a major trade center, the stopping point between the Rus principalities and Khwarezmian Empire. At least, it had been until Genghis Khan wiped the Khwarezmian Empire from the map. With extensive contacts in Khwarezm and the Kipchak tribes of the region, the Volga Bulgars were well informed of the fall of Khwarezm and approach of Subadai in 1223, and defeated him on the Volga River that year. Despite this victory, they were not left in a great position. The most powerful Rus princely state, that of Vladimir Suzdal, was encroaching on Bulgar territory and competing for control over the Mordvins, making one of the Mordvin principalities their vassal. The Bulgars tried to appease the Rus through peace negotiations, hoping to focus their effort for a Mongol return. It proved fruitless. In 1229, with Ogedai's ascension, came the second Mongol attack, in which Mongol forces seized the steppe from the Ural River to the Volga, overrunning the Bulgars' border guards. This attack was led by the commanders Kokatai and Sonatai, though it's commonly suggested that this Sonatai may have been a misspelling of Subadai in the source. If it was Subadai, he was soon recalled to aid Ogedai and Tolui in the final conquest of the Jin dynasty. The 1229 attack caused a great displacement of tribes, fleeing deep into Bulgar territory to escape the Mongols. Another attack came in 1232, spending the winter in Bulgar country, but were unable to move on to their capital. Relatively smaller armies had undertaken these two offensives, with significant forces dispatched under Chormakun to finalize conquests in Iran and accompanying Ogedai, Tolui, and Subadai to destroy the Jin, as we've covered in our previous episodes. Major resources were unavailable to attack Bulgar. Victory over the Jurchen Jin in 1234 changed this, freeing up troops to divert elsewhere. Most of the Mongol army and its auxiliaries were pulled back within weeks of the final victory over the Jin, though some forces remained on the border due to an attack from the Song dynasty. Despite Song attacks, Ogedai ordered only minor offensives against them for the time being. The West had to be dealt with. In 1235, a great Kurultai was held in Mongolia, to which the available princes of the dynasty were invited. In classic Ogedai fashion, upon their gathering, an entire month was spent in feasting, drinking, and celebrating. Gifts and loot were handed out from the treasury. The laws and ordinances of Genghis Khan were read out again. After this imperial bender, it was time to get to business. Ogedai's son Kochu was ordered to hold the frontier with the Song dynasty, while the rest of the available forces were to be taken west. The Mongol leadership was under the impression that the western end of the continent was home to fierce foes. Ogedai's only surviving full brother, Chagadai, had been collecting information for him. In The Secret History of the Mongols, Chagadai gives this warning to Ogedai. The enemy people beyond consist of many states, and there, at the end of the world, they are hard people. They are people who, when they become angry, would rather die by their own swords. I am told they have sharp swords. Chagadai's idea was that this should be a unified effort with all branches of the dynasty, that is, from the lines of Genghis Khan's 4 sons with Borte, contributing troops. This was agreed to. While the Western campaign is sometimes depicted as a sideshow, the sources inform us that the chief figures of the 3rd generation of Genghisids were present. A number of Jochi's numerous children, especially his most important sons, Orda, Batu, Shiban, and Tenkut, were to be present. From Chagai's line were Buri and Baidar. Buri, his grandson via Moetugen, Chagai's beloved favorite who had died in the Khwarezmian campaign. Ogedai's own sons, Guyuk and Kadan, represented him, and from the line of the late Tolui was his eldest, Monke, and Monke's half-brother, Oyak. If some of these names sound familiar to you, it's because these were among the most prominent Chinggisids of the next decades. Batu, founder of the Golden Horde, with Guyuk and Monke to be the great Khans in the years after Ogedai. Kolgen, a son of Chinggis Khan from a secondary wife, accompanied them, as did the most famous of all Mongol generals, Subadai. Well, Batu was the lead prince, and it was ostensibly his territory they were expanding. Subadai was to hold overall command. Ogedai wished to lead this army himself, but was talked out of it by the assembly. It was deemed too dangerous an expedition, and Ogedai's health may have already declined past being fit for such a trek. Each of these princes brought the troops attached to their households and appanages, resulting in a massive and diverse army. Common estimates range from 100 to 150,000 men, largely Mongolian and Turkic horse archers, but with an important contingent of Chinese siege engineers. Representatives of other conquered peoples joined them. Tanguts, Magyars, Khitan, Jurchen, already conquered Kipchaks, and perhaps even Central Asian Iranians. A mainly cavalry army, speed, maneuverability, and overwhelming firepower was its strength, taking advantage of the seemingly unlimited grassland and pasture of the Great Eurasian Steppe. We know at one point in the Kurultai, it was considered to send a vast army of Chinese along with them, but this idea was talked down. Yellow Chutsai declared that they were unfit to the climate of a long march. Now, a moment must be given to what the strategic goals were. The Kipchak and Bulgars were obviously targets, with the Rus to be punished for allying with them. In general, the Western Steppe was to be conquered, but beyond that? It's often said the famous European component of the invasion was an afterthought, little more than a raid. But there is some suggestion that Hungary was a definite target right from the beginning. Most Mongol imperial sources discuss Hungary, or rather their garbled name representing the kingdom, as a target from the outset. In the 1220s, the Hungarian king Béla IV, who we will meet in our next episodes, had declared himself king of the Cumans. The Hungarian kingdom wanted to expand its control over and convert the neighboring Cumans to Christianity. It's possible rumor made it down the steppes that the Hungarian king was not the Cuman king in name only, but the actual lord of the Cuman tribes. For the Mongols, who saw the Cuman Kipchaks as enemies, this made their king a major foe. As they moved west, they likely gained more accurate information on him, but in distant Mongolia, it was hard to correct that. Beyond that, we have statements from the likes of Friar Julian, who will be introduced later, starting in 1236, that the Mongols intended on attacking Rome. So the army, representing the four branches of the Chinggisid dynasty, had a goal to essentially conquer everything westwards, specifically intending on Europe as part of this. After the Kurultai, the princes returned to their ordus to assemble their forces, the various armies marching separately, setting out in spring 1236 to unite on the Kama River on the edge of Volga-Bulgar territory. We are provided an absolutely fascinating perspective from a Hungarian Dominican friar who traveled through Volga-Bulgaria on the eve of the Mongol invasion. Called Julian, or sometimes Julianus, he had been sent to find the Hungarians who remained in their old homeland. In a journey that took him across the steppe, through the Rus principalities and Volga-Bulgaria, he arrived east of Volga-Bulgaria in what he called Magna Hungaria, Great Hungary, inhabited by an Ugric people whose language, Julian was astonished to find, was mutually intelligible with his own, despite the 400 years since the Magyars had separated from them to enter the Pannonian Basin. These were the Bashkirs, related to the modern people of the same name in Russia's Bashkortostan, though the modern descendants have been thoroughly Turkicized. More relevant for us, Julian was in Magna Hungaria and Volga Bulgaria while Mongol armies gathered on the Kama River only a few days away. There's a sense that the Bulgars were quite aware of the strength of the Mongol army and the approaching terror, but lacked the manpower to repulse such a horde, leaving them to watch helplessly. During his time there, Julian encountered Mongol envoys moving ahead of the main army with demands of submission. Julian departed before the Mongol attack on Bulgar, and we are provided no specifics on the fall. The Bulgar cities were well fortified, their army of fine repute, but they had been weakened in recent years by conflict with the Rus and Mongols. Over the winter 1236, their capital cities were destroyed and the state of Volga Bulgaria ended. While there, Friar Julian heard that Saksan, a Turkish city along the lower Volga, had already fallen to the Mongols. Indeed, it seemed the Mongols made to secure the steppes around the northwestern Caspian before moving on to the Volga Bulgars. This was a region inhabited by the Kipchak Oberlai Kanglis of the Kuman-Kipchak Confederation, who had fought the Mongols several times. We have little specific details of this, except for one episode. Many Kuman-Kipchak peoples fled west before the Mongols, while others submitted, with limited resistance by one individual in particular. This was Bachman of the Oberlai Kipchaks, the ruler of a territory along the Akhtuba, a branch of the lower Volga. Bachman emerged sometime in the late 1220s and early 1230s, trying to organize against the Mongols. The leading Kuman-Kipchak chiefs had fallen to Zhev and Subadai during their campaign in 1222 and 1223, leaving few in the Kipchak steppe with the following or influence to rise up. According to the Yuan Shi, dating from the early Ming dynasty, part of Subadai's specific instructions had been to strike down this Kipchak chief. Before the fall of Volga Bulgaria, Subadai advanced with the vanguard ahead of the main and scattered Bachman's army somewhere along the Caspian Sea, capturing Bachman's wife and sons. Subadai then turned back for the Kama River to await the main army before moving on to the Bulgars. Bachman was reduced to irregular warfare with a small following, striking at Mongol parties while fleeing southwards. In early 1237, as the main army under Subadai continued on from the ruins of Volga Bulgaria, Monkey and his half-brother Boyek were dispatched to hunt Bachman down, each traveling down a bank of the Volga. Finding an old woman left behind by Bachman's troops, who pointed them after him, Monkey and Boyek cornered Bachman on an island in the river. Heaven showed its favor when the winds picked up and pushed the water back to reveal a ford. Crossing rapidly, Monkey and Boyek's army fell upon the unprepared and outnumbered Bachman, destroying the remnants of his men. Bachman was captured, asking only for the final honor to be killed by Monkey's own hand. Monkey instead had Boyek cut Bachman in half, essentially putting an end to any form of organized Kuman-Kipchak resistance to the Mongol advance. After Bachman's death, Monkey and Boyek marched back across the steppe to rejoin the main army, which had stayed busy. The Bashkirs had been dispersed and subjugated, Volga Bulgaria destroyed, the next target being the Mordvins, another Ugric people still extant today, giving their name to the Russian Republic of Mordovia. The Mordvins were divided into two principalities. Once both under Volga Bulgarian influence, the western had since fallen under the dominion of the Rus. The eastern principality submitted to the Mongols and provided troops. The western made the mistake of resisting and was crushed. This left the Mongols on the borders of the Rus principalities. Halting on the Voronezh River in late summer 1237, Batu and Subadai waited to allow Monkey and Boyek to rejoin them, finalizing their plans of assault, sending envoys to demand submission, and waiting for the rivers to freeze in order to cross them. The Rus principalities were the divided heirs to Kiev and Rus.